Hello, I'm Mabel Wilson, and I'm the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies and a professor in African American and African Diaspora Studies here at Columbia University, both organizer of today's event. I speak to you this evening on the traditional land and unceded territory of the Munsee Lenape, and I pay respect to their diaspora and honor the past, present, and future presence of the Lenape on their homeland. Welcome to this evening's panel, This is America, with Dr. Jelani Cobb, Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin, Dr. Robin D.G. Kelley, and Dr. Diva Woodley, and moderated by Dr. Samuel K. Roberts, who will more formally introduce the panel. I want to thank our co-sponsors for their generous support, Columbia's Office of Advancement, the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race, the Black Student Organization here at Columbia, and the Black Alumni Council. And as always, a special thanks to Sharon Harris and Sean Mendoza for making this evening possible. I want to frame This is America with Fannie Lou Hamer's harrowing testimony at the 1964 Democratic Convention, where she recounted how she and her neighbors were met with verbal harassment and bullets shot through their homes for attempting to register to vote in Mississippi. Hamer told a few months later that she was unlawfully arrested and beaten in a county jail by local law enforcement for daring to take a voter registration workshop. All of this, she pleaded in her statement, quote, is on account we wanted to register, to become first-class citizens. And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives be threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings? In America? End quote. This evening we'll address how and why the attack on voting rights, police violence, white supremacy, and other forms of anti-Black violence and disenfranchisement remain woven into the democratic fabric of America's public spaces and civic processes. Thus, how do we move forward after the recent pivotal election? I will now hand off to our moderator this evening, my colleague Samuel K. Roberts, who is an associate professor of history, African American and African Diaspora Studies, and Sociomedical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health. Professor Roberts writes, teaches, and lectures widely on African American urban history with a focus on medicine, public health, science, and technology.
Thank you so much, Mabel, and welcome to all of our invited guests, including the ones on the panel and you in the audience. Thank you so much for joining us. We have all looked forward to this conversation for quite some time now. It promises to be enlightening, illuminating, and entertaining, I believe, as well. There's a lot to discuss and a lot to learn here. It is my pleasure to be your host this evening. Pardon me. The genesis of this conversation was one that I and our director, Mabel Wilson, had several weeks ago, a bit after January 6th, when hundreds of ultra-right rioters and looters stormed the Capitol building, intent on, well, it's not exactly clear what they were intent on, but it appears to have included everything from disruption of the most sacred function of our republic, that is democratic elections, all the way down to the possible kidnapping and assassination of elected officials. Neither Professor Wilson nor I were particularly surprised that this had happened. After all, it was veritably predictable that a presidential administration that, objectively speaking, had done more than any other in the modern era to encourage right-wing terrorist organizations, to undermine trust in federal government, and to usurp democratic institutions would end in such a manner. What did surprise us was the persistent and incredulous commentary that, quote, this is not America, as though what we all watched 2 months ago now, hadn't been telegraphed to us for weeks by the president himself, as though we hadn't heard audio tape of the president attempting to overturn electoral results in Georgia, as though Charlottesville 2017 had not happened, as though 5 decades of racial pogroms had not occurred between the 1870s and the 1920s. The list goes on and on and on. Yes, this was America, and yes, this is America. However, there is a difference between not being surprised at the occurrence of something as horrible as January 6th and having a deep analysis of the events that led to it. And further, what we need is sound thought on what the future may hold. So we at IRAAS decided to do what we've done always since our founding in 1993. We invited leading scholars to think out loud about issues facing us today in the aftermath of a very strange day, of a very strange year, of a very strange presidential administration. It is my pleasure to introduce you to them this evening, although they really need no introduction at all. I will introduce them in alphabetical order. Jelani Cobb is an American writer, author, and educator. He is currently the Ira A. Lipman Professor of Journalism here at Columbia University. Cobb was previously an associate professor of history and director of the Institute for African American Studies at the University of Connecticut in Storrs, Connecticut. At the Africana Studies Institute, he specialized in post-Civil War African American history, 20th century American politics, and the history of the Cold War. He is a staff writer at the New Yorker and joined the Columbia Journalism School faculty in 2016. He's contributed to the New Yorker since 2012 and became a staff writer for the magazine in 2015. He is the recipient of the 2015 Sidney Hillman Award for Opinion and Analysis, writing and writes frequently about race, politics, history, and culture. Cobb is also the recipient of fellowships from the Fulbright and Ford Foundations. He is the author of the fantastic The
Yeah, that's
Substance of
good.
Hope.
That's enough.
Jelani, one day you're gonna let me finish introducing you. This is maybe the second or third time. I was the last sentence. The fantastic. This is an inside joke that he and I have too, by the way. The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama, and the Paradox of Progress, as well as To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip hop aesthetic. This would be the moment, Jelani, when we would all clap and welcome you. Next in alphabetical order is my dear colleague, Farah Jasmine Griffin, who is the inaugural chair of the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia University. She is also the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature. Professor Griffin received her BA from Harvard and her PhD in American Studies from Yale. Griffin is the author of many, many books and articles, including Who Set You Flowin'? The African American Migration Narrative. That's from Oxford Press, 1995. Beloved Sisters and Loving Friends, Letters from Rebecca Primus and Royal Oak, Maryland. And Addie Brown of Hartford, Connecticut, 1854 to 1868. If You Can't Be Free, Be a Mystery, In Search of Billie Holiday. And co-author with Celine Washington of Clawing at the Limits of Cool, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, and the greatest jazz collaboration ever. Along with that is Harlem Nocturne, Women Artists and Progressive Politics During World War II, which was published by Basic Books in 2013. Along with this, Griffin collaborated with composer and pianist Jerry Allen and director and actor Essa Patha Murkison on two theatrical projects for which she wrote the previous title book. The first production was Jerry Allen and Friends Celebrate the Great Jazz Women of the Apollo with Liz Wright, Diana Reeves, Terry Lynn Carrington, and others, which premiered on the main stage of the Apollo Theater in May of 2013. The second was A Conversation with Mary Lou, featuring vocalist Carmen Lundy, premiered at Harlem Stage in March 2014. It was performed also at the John F. Kennedy Center in May of 2016. Her forthcoming book, Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature, will be published on Norton in September of this year. This would be if were we in person, we would be applauding the arrival of my dear colleague, Farah Griffin. Next is Robin D.G. Kelley, who is the Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at the University of California, Los Angeles. His books include Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, Your Mama's Dysfunctional, Fighting the Culture Wars in Urban America, and Hammer and Hoe, Alabama Communists During the Great Depression. His essays have appeared in many, many places, including the Boston Review, the New York Times, Color Lines, Counterpunch, Rethinking Marxism, New Labor Forum, and Souls, like I said, just to name a few. And finally, Diva Woodley, who is an associate professor of politics at the New School here in New York City. She's the author of The Politics of Common Sense, How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance, from 2015 on Oxford Press. She's also held fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, as well as the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Her research covers a variety of topics, from media and communication to political understandings of economics to race and imagination and social movements. In each case, she focuses on the impacts of public discourse on the political understandings of social and economic issues, as well as how those common understandings change democratic practice and public policy. Her process of inquiry is inductive, moving from concrete real-world conditions to the conceptual implications of those realities. In all cases, she centers the perspective of ordinary citizens and political challengers with an eye toward how the demos impacts political action and shapes political possibilities. Her forthcoming book, the much anticipated Reckoning, Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements, is an examination of the ways that social movements repoliticize public life in times of political despair. It will be published on Oxford University Press, also in the fall of 2021, this year. Thank you so much, Farah, Jelani, Robin, and Diva, for joining us this evening. I hope this finds you well and holding up at the end of a very interesting year, right? Yeah. Good to see all of you. Thank you again. Let's get right to it. There's a lot to cover here. And I think just to start off, I might want to ask you all, just thinking back on the past 12 months, not the past 48, we'll get to that, right? But just the past 12 months, what for you have been the takeaways in terms of how have these impacted your work? How are you thinking about the country and the world? How are you thinking about social movements? I think I would like to start with maybe we should go in maybe reverse alphabetical order. So Diva, would you mind telling us what for you on what's today, March 9th, has been one of the principal takeaways for you in this past year?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is how important organizing is and how distinct, how the political phenomena of organizing is a distinct process that's actually, I think, separate from either mobilization, which is something that usually political campaigns do, or activism, which is something that people do when they're inspired to turn up in the streets. Organizing is a long-term process of subject making, right, and democratic subject making, in which people sort of learn how to become the kind of people who can act in a given situation. And I think that this year, because of the confluence of a variety of different things, right? It's an election year because of the pandemic. We have sort of relearned what mass organizing is all about. And I don't mean only the movement for Black Lives, which has always had a very robust organizing structure, but I think that that kind of understanding of the long-term process of political organizing has sort of proliferated in our public sphere. And I think it's been one of the most valuable things that has happened in the last year. And I think it's a lesson that will make it possible for us to move forward as a nation and perhaps save us from fascism.
Thank you. Robin, I think that puts you next. Welcome, Robin.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I'm just so happy to be here back in the IRAAS fold and the IRAAS family with all these folks, with yourself, with Farah, with Jelani, Diva, who I've not met, but now is part of the family. And maybe forgetting someone, but people who are not here, like, of course, Farah, my dear, dear friend, and Mabel, who gave me the invitation to be here, and Sharon Harris, people behind the scenes. Having said that, let me just pick up where Diva left off, is that I completely agree that organizing is a key lesson, a key takeaway, and that organizing, well, two takeaways. One is that fascism is upon us. That's another conversation to have, but fascism is not just simply an epithet, but a reality. And if we understand fascism's origins in in colonialism and settler colonialism, that in many respects, we've been dealing with fascism in this country for a very, very long time. It's just not named as such. But what we're seeing now, for some people, it surprised them. But just like Sam said, the Capitol insurrection, the actual date and the way it unfolded might be surprising a little bit, but the outcome wasn't surprising. Even for those of us in the streets with 26 million people during Black Spring, no one I knew thought this was the end of history, that this was going to be the victory of our time. And everyone that I know, and of course, everyone on this panel who does this work knows this, that this was a product not of, it wasn't the murder of George Floyd that brought people out. That was just simply the context for it. What brought people out was years of organizing, decades of organizing. You can see the roots of some of these movements in the 1990s in particular, pushing back against a kind of Clinton neoliberalism. And so, you know, this is the outcome that we're witnessing, and it should prepare us, I hope, for the coming years when we think that we could let our guards down or breathe a sigh of relief because the big bad Trump's out of office. The fact of the matter is that these are very dangerous times that we're facing ahead of us, and the organizing work is necessary if we're going to be able to respond and push beyond a kind of return to Clinton era neoliberalism.
Sorry, I just had my alarm going off there. Farah, I would like to call upon you to ask your thoughts and reflections on this, on the takeaway for the past 12 months, please.
What a 12 months, you know, and I think I would even agree with my fellow panelists that on the one hand, you know, there was nothing that was surprising at all, like the massive amount of Black and brown death. If, you know, when we found out this pandemic was coming, most of us knew who was going to be hit the hardest. And yet, what I would emphasize is that, or even the kind of, you know, the insurrection at the Capitol, that we weren't surprised. And if asked to predict based on our history, I think both of those things might have been things that we would have predicted even. But not being surprised by them doesn't mean that they are not stunning and doesn't mean that they are not, you know, impactful when you experience them, and that there isn't that part of us that says, I'm not surprised, but I didn't think I'd live to see it. You know, it's walking with that, being able to hold both of those truths, and or still like not being surprised by the devastation and levels of death, and yet being unmoored by it. And so I think that that's what the past year has really been for me, has been trying to hold both of those realities at the same time. Like Robin says, fascism has always been here. It has been much of our experience in this country for a long time. And also the inspiration of the organizers. And for me, someone who studies artistry and creativity, what I've been especially inspired by is the artists, the art that we continue to produce, and the creativity and artistry of our organizers. Also, that is a skill that is also an imaginative act, because you're imagining into being something that you're fighting for, but that you have to imagine as you create it. And so I've been inspired by that.
Yeah, it's often occurred to me that a lot of the ideas and dreams that motivate the movement aren't the ones that necessarily are taught to us in our schools. Like we have to reimagine or imagine these things, you know, completely de novo, from whole cloth. Thank you so much. Jelani, you joined us roughly four years and a month ago after the last election. And I, correct me if I'm wrong, I have a memory of the panelists were you, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Nicole Hannah-Jones, I believe. And I remember trying to get some note of optimism out of you all. Not an easy job, as I remember it. And yet, Diva began her comments with a note of strong optimism and affirmation. So I'm going to have to ask you, 49 months later, how are we feeling?
So I have revised that statement, first off, about the optimism, because it has come up. But, you know, I've said consistently, I have the optimism of a boxer in the late rounds. And so what that means is that you are quite aware that you're going to get punched in the face more times, but you've been punched in the face enough that you know how to stand up. You know how to take a punch. You know there's more of the fight behind you than there is in front of you. That you've learned to acquit yourself in the midst of battle. And I think that's the kind of optimism that we can forge from our tradition. You know, that's the optimism that people had, you know, on the street when they were attempting to do things that they had no rational reason to believe were possible, like create democracy in America, you know, despite the intention of having entrenched racial hierarchy and segregation. And so I think that that's the kind of way I view it. And, you know, if you look at the moment when I came here, I came here 2 months before the election, or 3 months before the election, and the journalism school had an all hands on deck meeting because students' parents, the international students, 40% of the population at this school, their parents were demanding that they come home because they were worried about their safety. They were concerned that their children, particularly children from Spanish-speaking countries, young people from predominantly Muslim countries were worried about being lynched. Like that was the reality that we were confronting at that point. And, you know, I think just to bring it, you know, into the time frame that everyone else has talked about, that what we've seen in the last 12 months is, you know, a stripping away of euphemisms that, you know, the right and, you know, the kind of moneyed and corporate interests and, you know, the alliance that we have seen, you know, of those forces waged a campaign of euphemism to make things that were intolerable seem as if they were just, you know, kind of technical terms. You know, in the way that we talk about killing innocent people as collateral damage. You know, you can say collateral damage and you almost think that you're talking about insurance or something that might happen to your car. And so when we saw the shutdown in March, and in New York City, you could go out and see the streets barren and empty, which I did. I rode my bike down to Times Square, empty. Rode to the East Side, empty. Rode to the Upper East Side, empty. And then I rode back up to Harlem and it looked like a regular business day because those were the people who were being dispatched to all these places to take care of the needs of those places. And so we got to see the machinery of inequality, the gears turning and whirring and producing the results. We've been debating about the results for so long, like, oh, this is because of this. This is because these people don't want to get married. They have children out of wedlock and all these other things. But we actually saw in George Floyd, a Black man who was unemployed, who was infected with COVID, and who was murdered by the police. And we're able to see the interconnections of those things. And I think that that is valuable, as horrific as it is one of the most valuable things I think that's happened in the past 12 months, that we're now having a different conversation. The nature of what happened is no longer, I think, in question.
Yeah, you know, it also occurs to me along with those three things that you know have fallen upon Floyd's name. You know, the other is that he you know had a history of battling with substance use disorder, and you know valiantly, and you know was doing everything he could to you know turn his life around. And now, as we see now, like in the jury selection, you know, and in the kind of lead up to the trial of I'm not going to say the name of the man who killed him, but you know, in that trial, the prosecution is clearly already making moves to highlight that history as though that has anything to do. That type of stigmatization is you know it's not going anywhere, at least not today. It isn't. Thank you so much to all of you for giving us that opening. I want to pivot a little bit. I was joking around a little bit about the optimism, a little bit. You know, I try to I think those of us who work in social movements, I think pessimism isn't really an option, right? We have to always maintain some sort of optimism. Like you said, the optimism of the pugilist in the last round. But also, I'm also an academic, which means, a certain amount of cynicism is baked into my intellectual DNA as well. So I try to hold both of those at the same time. And, this is a question I've wanted to ask you all for a while now, which is that so the Biden-Harris ticket, right? I think, it's a low bar, right? Like we like, if you're not happy about that compared to what happened before, then I don't really know what to tell you. But at the same time, uh, they were both the more conservative on the ticket, well, not on the ticket, on the stage during the primaries. So it's clear that they got elected. They would not have been elected were it not for Black voters, and particularly Black women. They, in that way, they're not really any different from any Democratic president in modern times, right? Since going back to Kennedy. What makes them a bit different, though, is their, immediate readiness to acknowledge that publicly. And it seems that they have made overtures and, policy, embarked on policy directions that seem to heed what Black movement demands have been articulated over the past several years. On the other hand, as I said, they were two of the more conservative on the platform, right, during the primary. So I guess the question that I've had in my mind for a while, and I'm glad to have all of you here to answer it for me, what should we expect from a Biden-Harris White House in terms of, what should Black progressives expect in terms of how far do we think they will go beyond that acknowledgement? What do you think is happening there? And I guess, there's a range of things, right? I mean, there's policing, there's voting rights, which is, that's, largely in Congress as well. So I think we might even expand that beyond the administration, but also this very fraught Congress as well. So I guess I should just pick Diva. Could I pivot that back to you as our movement analyst in residence?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I actually think that first of all, kind of to back up, I don't think that what's most hopeful about our politics right now is Biden-Harris, right? And I don't mean hopeful only in terms of a mood. I mean in terms of our hope for progressive, really imaginative, transformative policy and politics. However, I do think that they are particularly, and I mean the Biden-Harris administration, but also the Democratic Party as a whole, is attuned primarily because of the organizing feat that was pulled off in Georgia and to a lesser extent in Arizona, to the power and purpose and strength, right? Just the plain old, electoral strength of Black people and communities of color in other places in America. So I think that's why you see more receptiveness than is normal. And then also the strength of Black movement, right? It wasn't, no one has forgotten, as short as American attention spans are, no one has forgotten that 26 million people were in the street this summer. And not only Black people, a Black-led multiracial coalition of people were in the streets this summer. So the movement, I think the movement for Black lives over the past, 7 or 8 years has created a context, right? A discursive context in which you can talk about structural racism, racism in policing, and where you can praise the work of Black people, right? And have that be something that is well received among a multiracial coalition of people, and especially among kind of suburban, well-educated white people, basically. So the political context has changed in the last 7 or 8 years in terms of what kinds of discourses are acceptable and even expected of candidates who are not right-wing, right? I also think that the sort of I've been thinking a long time and a lot about how it is and why it is that Biden-Harris rose to the top of the ticket. And I think that there's something about an intergenerational kind of pressure that brought them to the top of the ticket, because it's not only Black voters and Black women voters, but older Black voters who sent them to the top of the ticket. And that might be in part because of familiarity with Biden, actual moderation in terms of policy preferences. But I think the biggest part of that is who do we feel like we can trust in a basic way, and who will these white people tolerate? I mean, honestly, I think that was the kind of calculation made by older Black voters. But at the same time, part of what sort of has given the Biden-Harris ticket the kind of made the necessity for and given them room to embrace a more progressive policy platform than they otherwise would have is the power of young Black movement, right? So those two sort of pressures are converging right now on this administration and in the Democratic Party. And it's through that tension, I think, is where I think the sort of most hopeful possibilities for progressive policy will come. But of course, one thing this administration has to do in order to make anything else possible, and not just the administration, the Congress, is to pass the voting rights, John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Without that, then it kind of, all the zeitgeist, all the power that we have built, that movement has built, and other apparati, right, have built over the last many years, will be difficult to nurture, maintain, and grow. So I think that, for me, whenever I think about the politics of this era, it's really, the power of the people that I think about. But I don't think about that in an abstract way. It's not like the public mood, it's the actual organizing people are doing and the things that we have built.
Can I jump in with something really quick?
Please do.
To kind of augment Diva's point, to what she was saying about those older Black voters. The last trip I took, actually, before everything was shut down, was to South Carolina for the Democratic primary last year. I heard that a lot. In talking to people and going around in the conversations I had with older Black voters, it was very much calibrated toward what will white people tolerate. And that was one of the things that they would say, like, oh, Bernie Sanders, they're never going to vote for him. That was just a thing it would say. The other thing is that, interestingly enough, in 2008, Hillary Clinton was excoriated for the kind of retail politics that she did in South Carolina. And Barack Obama ran circles around her, just built an organization from the ground up, ran circles around the Clinton machine. In South Carolina, Biden's people really did use the machine thing to their advantage. And so in talking with people who were connected to the campaigns on the ground there, they were just elucidating the mistakes that other candidates had made, even fundamental stuff. One guy I know who knows like kind of inner workings of South Carolina politics better than almost anybody, was talking about the number of campaigns that didn't hire people from South Carolina. And they're just like, just flat out, that wasn't gonna fly. And Biden's people knew, when you go to South Carolina, you call this person has a consultancy, they hook you up with this, and they had a better kind of grasp of those things. That was also part of like how they were able to win in South Carolina and then have the domino effect in other places.
Thank you. I just realized, I think I might inadvertently have my Zoom settings to share screen, because Diva, basically, I think you read my next question there in your answer. So I'm just going to go ahead and pile it on anyway. And I want to add to that before I go to Robin and Farah, to also ask, along with that question, is about the movement politics and where we're going with that. And Farah, and in either of you could take this in whichever order you like. Farah, you work with a fantastic organization here in New York, Brother Sister Soul. You are a pioneering scholar in Black girl movement studies and activism, scholarly activism. So I want to ask you a bit about your thoughts on that. And then Robin, and not necessarily in this order, Robin, you've been on my mind. I believe it's your first book, Hammer and Hoe. That was your first book, correct? Yeah, and I think I don't know if you're going to do another edition of it, but in like they're organizing in the same area that you wrote about with Amazon. I mean, it's kind of, well, not, I was about to say eerie. It's not eerie, but certainly an interesting historical link there. So I might ask you, in terms of movement politics, and your work, either current or past, what are your thoughts about building a movement moving forward? Since Diva just, like I said, either I guess she hacked my computer and answered the next question or whatever might have happened. Any takers?
Robin, you want to go?
Okay, no, I thought you were going to go to Farah first. Yeah, I'll say a few things because I actually did want to respond to the specific question that you posed and also connected to movements. I mean, I am concerned. We have a long history with the Democratic Party, and by way of this, just full disclosure, I'm not a Democrat. I will never be a Democrat. I'm not a Republican, but I don't really go into. I'm not like a pro-Democrat person. I think that's a party that has actually done us wrong in many ways, for reasons that could be understandable. So I think that there's instructive lessons to be learned from Fannie Lou Hamer and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party and the refusal to be sold out. I think there are instructive lessons to be learned from Jesse Jackson's campaign in '84, second to a certain degree in '88 as well, where you had these independent movements at the edge of the Democratic Party that were pushing for a politics that was rooted in social movements in a way the Democratic Party found intolerable. I mean, you have to always remember that, it's exactly those young, not just young people, but the movements that Diva was talking about brought us to this crisis. And there were movements that emerged both in opposition to Clinton and in opposition to Obama. So there's a way in which this idea that we are kind of wedded to the Democratic Party is something that I think has actually been problematic for these social movements. So if you think about where we are at the moment, when Biden says America is back, and we think about the world and foreign policy, we think about the fact that, besides a foreign policy that's going to continue to support AFRICOM, that's going to continue to try to overthrow Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And we think about the fact that he picked a Black man, General Lloyd Austin, as the first Black Secretary of Defense. And we're supposed to be all happy that this is a guy who's a show for Raytheon, and because he's Black, and so this identity politics that the Biden-Harris people are doing, and that's not to say that they're not picking good people every once in a while, but it's a very dangerous move, and we've seen it. So coming back to the question of Amazon, I mean, right now we're witnessing one of the most important labor struggles in the country, and one of the most important in the world, second to the general strike in India of 250 million people. And so what's happening in Bessemer, Alabama right now is an attempt to, for the first time, to organize Amazon workers. And they may succeed because the history of struggle in the Birmingham, Bessemer area is very long and noble. But remember, the same Amazon, like Target, like Cadillac, like Petco, were the first ones to shout Black Lives Matter and have these really moving commercials that make you so proud to be Black, especially Cadillac, and the Cadillac workers, right, are not treated the same way they're imagined Black people are to be treated, right? So I think that in some ways, this is a crucial moment, despite Biden's nod to support unionization in Amazon, which is great. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is that we need to be able to pivot to support, in addition to movements against state violence, to support labor and recognize that it's Black labor, Black women's labor in particular, that's at the forefront of this struggle. And that historically, the Democratic Party has not been friendly to labor, period. It just hasn't. And I know it doesn't appear that way compared to Republicans, but again, why compare, you know, one evil for a worse evil? So I think that this is a crucial moment where if we're going to respond to America is back, we've got to be able to think, what is going to be our response considering the global situation with the economy, the situation for working people in this country, for Black and Brown and Indigenous working people in particular, not to get caught up or swept up into the enthusiasm around a regime that has replaced the worst that we've had in the 20th century, but one that doesn't necessarily doesn't necessarily sort of open up a portal to something that could really improve the lives of people who are making less than minimum wage or even at minimum wage.
Yes, Robin, like, first off, to your point about the websites for Black Lives Matter, I remember like seeing some of those websites and saying, it would be an improvement if you just said lives matter. because even the white people who work for you, like, our lives don't matter to you. But I think that, I don't know, I feel like in 2020, there was a fierce pragmatism that you saw with people. Like, I don't think people were caught up in a kind of magnetism of the Democratic Party,
right,
or Biden, or certainly Kamala Harris,
right,
who I think has gotten a free pass in a lot of ways, especially the calculations I knew among people of like stories that didn't run, essays that didn't get published, one of my own included, about her and the death penalty, where it was also saying, what is the likelihood that the right wing, the far right, will be able to utilize this and then in their bid to reinstall Trump,
right,
which gave them, I think, a kind of like glide path in a way. But it seemed like a lot of people were really looking like out of the corner of their eye at everybody on that stage, save for Bernie and maybe Elizabeth Warren in a lot of instances.
Right. No, I don't disagree, and I'll be real quick because I want to hear what Farah has to say. But I don't disagree with that. And in fact, there was a kind of pragmatism, but the pragmatism had a certain cost to it. Because remember how it was like, don't start talking that defund the police business because we might undermine our chances to get Biden elected. And so there's a way in which it was a kind of a pivot. And I know that people are trying to pivot back again, and we're going to get to those questions later, I'm sure. But I know that the strategy, the tactic was to make sure that Biden-Harris, make sure that Trump is defeated. And he was defeated, and he was defeated and still got the second highest vote total in US history. And so these are very trying, dangerous times, but there's got to be a way in which we don't always give up so much for the sake of making sure that there's someone who we think could be a shield, And I know that you're not saying he's a shield, but there's a way that people think, well, the Biden-Harris, they're a shield to us, and now we can breathe easily. When in fact, this is a time to push harder and harder than ever.
Yeah, I think at the core of the question was that, as you said, Robin, and certainly, this is something you've chronicled in your work, that the Democratic Party has not been averse to putting us on a sacrificial altar. Once votes are cast, our fate isn't really ever completely known within that party. So it's something certainly that we should about which we should have some concerns. Farah, I wanted to bring you in and reiterate the question I had for you before, as somebody like Robin who thinks in terms of the imaginative, the political imagination, the political imaginary. On what movements are you keeping your eyes? Despite the fact that we're all uneasy about a Biden-Harris administration that very well could, not be entirely responsive, shall we say?
Yeah, well, in terms of the administration, my hope is that, you know, we will continue to hold their feet to the fire. And I think that, you know, they will sacrifice us easily. I mean, we know that, right? But that we still have to be prepared to hold their feet to the fire. And maybe this time at least we have the ability to remind them of their recognition of the things that we say are the issues that should be of concern, that they are acknowledging more so than previous administrations, including President Obama's administration. I'm very interested in local, like I'm very interested in what people do on the ground from their communities. You mentioned Brotherhood, Sisterhood, Soul, like what are people doing in their communities, in their zip codes? And I had just written down Bessemer, Alabama, because I keep my eye on Alabama because of Robin's work and because of the legacy that comes out of Alabama, because of Imani Perry's work. And I keep my eye on the South, recognizing that Georgia is not South Carolina, is not Alabama, that these all have different sort of political traditions. Jelani talked about the machine in South Carolina. You know, there's the legacy of radical Black politics in Alabama. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing in Bessemer. And I think we have to find ways to continue to be informed about that work, because we get a lot of attention on Georgia at the end of the election or after Biden is elected, because people are interested in whether or not we're going to win the Senate. Thank God we did. And thank God we won with the candidates that we won. But that attention, that same kind of attention, we're not getting on Bessemer, Alabama, and the unionization efforts going there. You know, we have people like Danny Glover going there, using his celebrity to call attention to that, or to what's happening in Jackson with water, right? So I'm fascinated by by local movements, by the ways communities organize themselves, and keeping my eye on each one of those different configurations in the South.
Yeah,
Thank you.
One last thing before I shut up, because I'll be really, really in trouble if I don't say this. And I think Robin may remember this, but my late mother was from Bessemer, Alabama. And I still have family there. And as well, I would like Imani Perry and I have wondered if our families knew each other back in that area. But I'm always indebted to Robin, because he literally wrote my family history. You know, my grandfather was a coal miner in Bessemer. And I remember talking to my mother and then making the connection between the book I read and the stories that she was telling me about my family. I almost fell over. And so I think it's just really, this is not that you need it, but there's another reiteration of just how crucial your work on that subject has been.
Yeah, but you know, it's so beautiful. I remember those conversations we had. And it's also a lesson, the lesson that Cedric Robinson taught me was that the South is key. He kept saying the South is key. He said, you know, the problem, the mistake that the American Communist Party made was they didn't realize a lot of them were from all over the world as first generation immigrants, but they didn't understand the South. The South was always key. Way before the 30s, the South was key. In the 1860s, the South was key during, you know, the period of enslavement. And this is, I think, the key lesson that we sometimes missed in our attacks, in our crisis mode of Trump being elected. Because I remember here in LA, how frustrated I was when all these people in LA are like the left coast, so progressive, you know, we got the biggest prison population, so what, you know, but we're so progressive, and the South is to blame. And meanwhile, all these movements are popping up, you know, coming out of that legacy. And it's a really important story to tell. So I appreciate that, Jelani. I really do. And your family was just amazing.
Robin, if you release another edition of Hammer and Hoe, I think Jelani could write a blurb for you on the back cover as well. So we'll be looking for that. At this moment, I want to do a little housekeeping, station identification, so to speak. I forgot to mention to our audience, please do put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be monitoring that for questions from the audience. We are about at our 2/3 mark. So I would like to open up for some Q&A. And then also you can follow us on Twitter, the Institute for Research in African American Studies and the newly christened Department in African American and African Diaspora Studies. Our Twitter handle is at IRAAS-ColumbiaU, at IRAAS-ColumbiaU. So please follow us for coverage of this conversation and also announcements for future events that we will be having here, including some, I believe, as soon as next week. I think there might be 1 or 2 next week and throughout the rest of the semester. I want to go back to a couple of other points that we haven't put. And I guess another question is, we've talked a bit about, well, actually, no, we haven't. I want to talk a bit about policing reform and certainly the kind of localism about that. A number of you have pointed out that the local is really important. I think in a lot of ways, you know, I'm loath to give credit to, you know, kind of the ultra right, but I mean, certainly they have shown us that in the way over the past 30 years, they've captured state houses, you know, governors' mansions, all the way down to school boards, which, you know, no one ever paid attention to until you realize, why do all the textbooks look like this? And it's like, well, you know, look at the school boards. Certainly, I think the tenor of this discussion over the past half hour or so has talked about the locality of, or the localism, and the necessity of that. That word necessity is in the title of your forthcoming book, Diva. So I think this might be a good place, or you would be a good person to start us off on that. What, in terms of local movements, how do we think about, I guess in particular, police reform? I want to pivot. I know this is a kind of awkward pivot. There's no transition or segue here. But you know, we've talked a lot about what the White House is. I mean, we meaning not us in this on this panel, but you know, the country, without actually understanding that, you know, we're not entirely sure how much of a bully pulpit there actually is. You know, police departments are entirely local in a lot of ways. What are your thoughts about that in terms of local organizing and how we do that? Because you know, as one or maybe more of us said, you know, defund the police has been taken off the table by Washington. Like, Biden didn't even want to ask what it was about. He just said, I'm not going to do that. But it is, you know, it's nonetheless it's a compelling idea. It's an urgent one as well for what it means. So could you tell us just a bit more in your thoughts, what we're going to do there?
Well, it's already begun, right? Like, see, this is the sort of irony of the, or the reason why the location of the most progressive or hopeful politics is not going to be national politics, or even necessarily Democratic Party politics, except at the edges. Because we have to remember that this year, for the first time, movement has also elected people to Congress, right? And won mayorships. And, you know, so there are people who are in the Democratic Party who are from right movement. But my point is that on local organizing, since the defund demand, came out this summer, there have already been a dozen police departments that have had funds taken from their ledgers, right? Now, this is not a straightforward fight. In some of those cases, the body that controls the police budget would take away money, and then they would win it back on appeal, or some other body would give, or it would be like kind of a shell game. That's kind of what happened in New York City, right? So some of that is happening, right? It's not a straightforward game, but more and more, right? The underlying, impetus of defund the police, which is we need to remove money from policing and put it into social supports, is gaining steam and being implemented. Just recently in Ithaca, New York, the mayor of Ithaca, New York, announced that, or put a proposal to his city council that said, I think we need to dissolve the police department and develop a department of community safety instead. And this department will be made up of 2/3 people who are unarmed social support people and 1/3 unarmed people who will be rehired, right? Like we're not gonna stay with the same people who are in the police department right now. So that idea has a ton of momentum, and people are shaping it at the local level. There's also legislation moving through several different states to take to break down the power of police, right? So break things that seem very esoteric, like repealing mandatory minimum staffing for police departments, right? This is something that is happening in different states all over the country. That doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is, right? In the 1990s, many police departments won the right through referendum or legislation to have a permanent level of staffing that is lawfully must increase every year, right, by a certain amount. So breaking down those sorts of things, like that's happening in 6 or 7 states around the country. Then you have other things that are happening in the same vein that are about actually putting teeth to the sort of civilian oversight boards that exist in 26 or 27 states in the country. And that means these civilian oversight boards have been formed at different times in the 90s and 2000s, and some in 2014, right, since 2014, to say that, police, misbehave all the time, and we need a civilian oversight board that can keep track of all of these bad behaviors, but almost none of those boards actually have the power to enforce their recommendations, right? That's also something that people are pushing to change right now, and it's getting traction. So, this is a long road, but it is a road that people are now willing to travel. And movement has given people the language to make these demands. So even though Biden at the top and most mainstream Democrats are like, we don't want to defund the police, right? That's not what we're going to do. And in some cases, right, Biden in particular is like, let's give them more money for training, right? Like that is a thing that is also happening. But on the other side, there are a lot of people who, even if they don't adopt the language of defund the police, have accepted the logic of defund the police. And according to my work, right, this is sort of the work I do, is that is when social movements really start to become successful. Because it's when you change the logic by which people think through political problems, more so even than when you win policy, right? Because policy can be rolled back, particularly policy that's taken at the state level or municipal level. This is what happened, for example, for many years with the living wage, right? But if you change the logic by which people analyze problems, if you change the logic of what constitutes safety, if you change what police reform means to most people, that's where you start to get the momentum to really make transformative changes. And there's evidence that is happening.
Thank you. I don't think I knew that about Ithaca. That's who's the mayor? Myrick, is it in Ithaca? I knew that he had some interesting policies about harm reduction and drug policy reform. I think I met him at a conference some years ago, but I didn't know about this. I'll have to look that up. Thank you.
Yeah, it was just announced.
Really? Okay, I'm slow on that. I need to get word on that. Something else that I found interesting about that, and thank you for the deep dive on that as well, Diva. Really, it sounds as though you're saying that in many cases, I think you mentioned 24 states. There is an apparatus, right? There's this scaffolding. I mean, it might be a hollow shell, or maybe it's been eviscerated over decades, but at least it's there. That, like, on the, and as Jelani and I were joking earlier, I'm trying to look for the good, for the silver lining in the cloud. It sounds like you're saying that in many cases there is an administrative structure that is just it's a paper tiger at this point, but at least it's there, and these new logics can inhabit these structures. Is that what you're saying? That we have these civilian review boards, never mind that right now they've got no power, but at least they're there, and that we, with the right movement logic and the right movement strength, we can give them power. Am I?
Possibly, but the civilian review boards are municipal; they're not at the state level. But
Right,
I mean,
right, yeah.
but it doesn't have to be those apparati, right? It can be, but it doesn't have to be. My point is there's a lot of structures and there's a lot of places to attack, and people are being very creative about how do we diminish the power of police forces? How do we diminish their access to resources? And that's the logic of defund the police, whether or not you accept the slogan.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to open that up with Diva gave us a lot to think about there. So if anybody would like to add on to her answer to that question, or as I just did, ask her for follow-up answers with more questions for her, please do. I, for one, have always found it interesting, Diva, that, unlike in many other places, if you call 911 here, you get either an ambulance, a fire truck, or somebody with a gun. But most emergencies don't really need either of those or any of those, really. If your house is burning, sure. If you're having a heart attack, sure. But, what if your son who has a mental health condition is acting erratically? You don't want a gun, somebody with a gun showing up. So I think certainly that's part of the reform, as you were saying, that we need to have social services. When you dial 911, somebody else, social workers perhaps, should be called upon to arrive. Again, I want to remind our audience, and again, I'm going to ask our panelists, not remaining, but our other panelists, Farah, Robin, and Jelani, if you'd like to add on something to Diva's answer,
Yeah,
please do.
I just thought something really quickly. I really appreciated the answer. And I think just to sort of highlight the shift, police reform is so many reforms that are being proposed, especially by the current administration, are not new. It's like the same thing of better training, altering use of force policy, more transparency, more Black cops, residency requirements, all that, banning chokeholds, all these things are there. But I think what's different now is the recognition that even just having body cams is not enough, that there's got to be a more of an abolitionist approach, which this is sort of a halfway move, that is to replace the police with other forms of public safety, but still have that kind of armed section. But to really move toward abolition, I think that's going to be the coming struggle. Whether or not an abolitionist approach will win or just be co-opted into and used just as a word to cover for the same old reforms.
Yeah, there is that challenge too, because quite often those existing structures have an internal logic of their own that has to be overcome. It's not always a matter of just, like a hermit crab kind of moving into an empty shell. Sometimes you do have to create these from scratch. I'm sorry, Farah, I think I cut over you there.
That's okay. I mean, I have a lot of questions, so I won't be long. One of the things I think that it's worth considering is not only, I mean, we necessarily have to focus on the police. It's important, but I think that there are these kind of overarching structures of white supremacy and white supremacist logic that are, and policing is part of that. And if we, those of us on this panel, those of us who represent the communities we represent, are not surprised, but maybe the country has been surprised by the number of people at the Capitol who were police officers, who were military. And I think that those are questions that, not to paint with a broad brush everyone who is a police officer, but to think about those connections that allow us to be focused on police and policing, but to also recognize police as an institution that's part of our society, where these white supremacist logics have infiltrated into every single institution we have, most dangerously, policemen, congressmen.
We haven't even talked about the educational systems either, right? I mean, and we all know about how those are so densely networked within each other, or with each other.
Can I say something really quick?
Yes.
In like 30 seconds. I have a book, a revised edition of the Kerner report coming out. That's all. No, seriously. When we were doing,
because Jelani, you did cut me off when I was doing your introduction. You could have mentioned that thing. Please, I'm sorry. Continue, please.
But I will say what's really interesting is that I was doing when I was working on revising this, the unabridged Kerner report is like 900 pages, and Norton said, "Can you get us a 300-page version of it?" And we're like, "No, we can't do that." We got cutting, kind of like repetitions and all these things. And when you really get into the weeds, I got down into a footnote in the Kerner report issued in 1968 that said they needed to defund the police, which is amazing. And so they didn't use the words defund the police, but what they said was that they were aware that there are an array of concerns in communities, they use the language ghetto, they said in ghetto communities that don't require police, but for which police are the only resource available. And this has the effect of creating volatility and creating circumstances that invariably go awry. And that there needed to be, I think they called them community social service centers that could address problems that were not police related. And I almost fell over because I said, but for the language of what people were saying, they realized this in 1967 when they were working on that, that report. And even the kind of middle of the road politics of the Kerner group saw the way that that chain reaction functions. And so to Robin's point about saying that these things are not new, it really, really is not.
Yeah, I'm glad. So they're going to publish that in its entirety, all 900 odd pages?
No. I've a revised version. I think we got to like 350 pages or so that will be out in September.
All right, because some of those repetitions are telling in that report. I'm not going to claim to have read it
Yeah.
cover to cover, Jelani. I mean, that's for you. But some of those repetitions are certainly telling. You know, another interesting incident, 20 years after that, Mayor Kurt Schmoke, I don't know if anyone here remembers that, but you know, he's a former prosecutor, and he goes to the Conference of Mayors and says, we're spending too much money on police and chasing people who use drugs, and it's, you know, we're just making the HIV crisis worse. We need to put this into public health. And he's roundly pilloried in Congress by a lot of Black politicians too, unfortunately. I think, like you said, these ideas are not entirely new. There's a lot of work to submerge them, you know, people in opposition to them. Okay, we have to get to, I was just reminded that we have questions in the queue. So let me, oh yes, quite a few here. I want to, all right. All right. So Farah, this is from a colleague of yours, Abraham Velasquez, who says at Brotherhood Sister Soul, we've called for the divestment of police from schools and investment in mental health support and actual safety for youth of color and Black girls in particular. Do you have any, and Farah, by the way, I don't think Mr. Velasquez made this question for you. I've just said this is somebody who is in the same organization on whose board you serve. So don't feel like this is just for you. I'm sorry, I lost my place. He says, do you have any recommendations for adding pressure to city council, the mayor, and the governor? I think, you know, at least the last of those three certainly could use some pressure. Or are there other models nationally or successful police-free schools that we can reference? So that's for the group. And thank you very much, Abraham Velasquez, for that question. I don't know if anybody here does political strategy.
I would just say, and I'll defer to others because we would benefit from your knowledge. But and now this is a plug. The organization is having two sort of forums with mayoral candidates where the questions are all being asked by young people. And these are young people who've been trained as community organizers through three or four different organizations, not just Brotherhood Sister Soul. And I would think that those kind of forums are actually really good for getting people during their campaigns to go on the record addressing these issues. And this has been a long-term campaign of the Brotherhood Sister Soul, as was the working against stop and frisk, but that is certainly one place to intervene. But there are certainly probably many others.
All right, would anybody else like to tackle that, Diva?
Yeah, I would say that there are several states now that have legislation pending to make sure that cops are not allowed in school. And I was just about to give you sort of the list of those states, but I could not find it. But it's Illinois, there's several. There are like 5 or 6 states where this is legislation that's pending. And then there are municipalities that have done this too. So I think that the best way to do it is actually not through, we're really obsessed with our executives. I think it's legislators where you put the pressure and also where you can replace them, right? Like legislatures, you know, the level, I think, of the politics should not necessarily always be at the executive level, but definitely at the level of legislature.
Yeah.
And movements, because Oakland Black Organizing Project and also the Community Rights Campaign in LA both succeeded in just putting pressure through organizing civil disobedience to both decriminalize tardiness and truancy and to abolish school police. And LA had the longest history of a police designated for schools going back to the 1940s, and they were able to push them out.
Thank you. Diva, you said you were looking for information about states. Was it states or municipalities which had taken police out of schools?
Well, both. And
Both?
this is, both. And this is, I mean, there have been long-running efforts from organizers, right, movement folk to do this, but there's been traction since the summer, basically. We have legislation pending in several states that would get police out of schools. Another area that people are working in is to get police separated from traffic enforcement. And that would be huge.
Yeah.
The vast majority of civilian contact with police is through traffic enforcement, and there's legislation pending in several states to separate police from that function. That would transform people's lives and also transform the profession of policing. And in addition, Professor Griffin, what you were talking about in terms of, I think it was Professor Griffin you were talking about, oh no, it was you, Sam, it was actually you, who was talking about, having social service answer calls instead of armed police. That's also already happening. That's happening in Denver, Colorado. That's happening in Oakland, California. Right. Many municipalities have undertaken these pilot programs. And I think Denver, Colorado is the oldest one. They implemented it in like July, right, of this year. And it's been hugely successful. They route 911 calls according to, whether or not it is a question of, mental health, housing, distress, right? That's not going to be violent, right? That's going to be presumed nonviolent. And they send unarmed people who are appropriate to the task. And so far, right, in the last 6 months, they've not had to call in the police once. They haven't made any arrests, and they've actually been helping people.
Wow, thank you. The one of the few advantages that Zoom offers us over in-person meeting is that we can crowdsource information that we need. So if anybody finds the link or any sort of site that Professor Woodley was, that she herself was trying to find, you can just put in the Q&A and then we can kind of just let people know. If anybody finds that list of municipalities and states which have embarked on these reforms. We have a question from Marvin Sin, whose name is very familiar to me. I want to say that he is a friend of the Institute. Good evening, Marvin Sin. Your question is, while the political arena does impact the environment we live and work in, what is the status of movements within the Black community for self-reliance and cultural sovereignty? I think this goes to a bit to what you just said, Robin. And I would like, if I might ask you all to maybe give some sort of comment. There's another question here also about organizing in the arts, particularly in jazz, which was directed specifically, Robin, to you and Farah. But I think for all of us, can we think about what are the meanings of self-reliance and cultural sovereignty? I think quite often in our political movements, there's this tension between, visions of sovereignty and self-reliance, but then also an equally compelling acknowledgement that we are citizens and part of a polity where we have an investment in the state such that it is. So maybe if you all could just give, that's a half-formed thought right there, and certainly not the first that I've had this evening, so you'll forgive me. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Sin's question?
I'm hesitant to try to respond. I feel like I talk too much, but I'll be real brief on it's an excellent question. I would just say two things. One, some of the best examples I could think of. Well, one is what's happening or what's trying to happen in Jackson, Mississippi, where you have an attempt on the part of a radical movement holding local power, but also trying to create cooperatives, basically cooperatives where people could basically sustain themselves without having to rely on companies like Nissan, for example, that hire some of the workers living in Jackson. But also, what does that mean for a city where its infrastructure is just crumbling? And my sister lives there in Jackson, and one of the things that she talks about is like, how do we, in terms of our attempts to be self-reliant and self-sufficient economically, politically, and culturally, how do you do that in a capitalist system where even contracting itself is a for-profit process in which a lot of overhead that the city would pay out, even to Black contractors, would end up not necessarily solving the problem. But then the second thing I just say to that is that when we talk about the question of sovereignty, we also have to remember that there's a larger question of sovereignty in Turtle Island about indigenous nations who have been stripped of sovereignty, and what will be our role in the restoration of that sovereignty, because restoring that sovereignty also means trying to restore our relationship to the earth in a different kind of way. So it's one thing to be self-reliant within a capitalist system. It's another thing to think about self-reliance in terms of our relationship to the earth and ways of collectively helping each other as we move forward, even beyond the boundaries of what we think of as the Black community.
Thank you, Robin. And I just realized before, Farah, I asked you to comment. I did not do justice to that second question. I kind of just, truncated it. The question that was pitched to you and Professor Kelley was, as I said, about organizing in the arts, particularly in jazz. But the part of the question that I skipped was, there are many individuals and groups, often white, actively trying to manage and suppress resistance from Black women, especially. What models would you point Black artists, organizers, activists to in this moment? I apologize to this person's anonymous to having truncated the last 2/3 of that question.
I was going to initially address Marvin Sin's question. You're right. Hello, Marvin, is a friend of the department, and he's part of a talk about kind of self-reliance. He's part of a group of Black alums who have endowed the first prize in our department. Black alums who were graduates of Columbia, participated in the protests of '68, and have endowed a prize for student activists in the name of one of their classmates who was very much involved in community organizing and activism while he was a student and then throughout his life, Zach Husser. So our first endowed prize is endowed by that group of Black alums.
Now, see, I wasn't going to blow up. I wasn't going to blow up Mr. Sin's spot. I just said, oh, I recognize the name. But yes, you. Yes,
well,
he is
so
long-standing friend of the department. Thank you for joining us, Marvin.
Long-standing number of other members of that committee, just wonderful. So thank you. One of the things that comes immediately to mind, this isn't kind of the long-standing organizing that happens in communities, but I'm thinking about the ways that certain groups, people, individuals have organized in the face of COVID and the failures of the state to address the needs of Black working, Black poor, Black and brown communities. In Philadelphia, my hometown, the Black Doctors organization, similar efforts in places like LA. And one of the things that it's done is it's really shown the failure of government to address a public health crisis and to address those people who are most in need of it, a need of, a kind of public health interventions, and that these organizations of Black professionals, Black communities, Black churches have organized to try and address something that is so overwhelming that they should not be the only ones having to address it. And so to me, I see that as a kind of building on an ongoing legacy of the ways that our communities have tried to, display the kind of organizing self-reliance and the ongoing need for it. In terms of the other question about models, I'm calling a blank now. There are some, organizing amongst women in the jazz community. And I'm thinking about something like what Terry Lynn Carrington has organized at Berkeley, the Institute for Jazz and Gender Justice, with people like myself and Angela Davis on the board that, have been trying to address exactly some of those issues that this person raises in their question.
Thank you so much. I want to ask our other two panelists if they had a further comment. We're about at our last 90 seconds here. So rather than embark on another question, I think I want to ask for some final comments from each of you. And we can begin with Jelani and Diva. What are you looking to see over, say the next, I hesitate to say the next year. I mean, God knows what could happen in the next year. I mean, so we won't even do that. But what are you keeping your eyes, say over the next couple of months or so? What are we looking for?
Diva mentioned something I think that is very significant, and that is House Bill 1 and the profound democratic implications of this. And I went back. I was looking at Eric Foner's newish book, most recent book, Second Founding, on the 15th Amendment, and just the debates that went on. We talked about 13th, 14th, 15th, but the debates that went on around the extension of the franchise to Black men at the end of the Civil War. And it was specifically to be a bulwark against a white supremacist movement that threatened to destroy American democracy. And the resonance of that is 151 years later. That is exactly what we're called upon to do, to protect the Black vote in order to forestall a white supremacist movement that threatens to destroy American democracy. And I think that what happens going forward, there's always the possibility that this bill is passed and then murdered judicially, but it's important that at least this be the starting point. And it'll be fascinating to see, and really crucial to see how this plays out in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you. House Bill 1. Diva, what are you?
Yeah, I would just echo that. And I'm so happy to, or maybe not happy, but so enlightened to learn that about the debate about the 15th Amendment. I would say that House Bill 1 is also the thing that I am most keenly looking at in the next little bit here, because without it, I really, I don't think we can overstate the consequences of not passing federal voting rights. I think that then we will be in a state of war, honestly, in a state of civil war. And I don't mean that in terms of hyperbole. I just mean that we'll be then locked into permanent rule by a increasingly white supremacist and fascist minority. And there will not be a kind of electoral way out of that. So the Democrats better get it together in terms of the filibuster.
Farah. I think you're muted.
This bill, we looking forward to how things, unfold in all the places that we've been talking about, and including New York. There was a question I saw about even local New York politics with someone like AOC, very much interested in that. And I'm always interested in what young people are going to call to my attention that I'm not even aware of. You know, that there's a way that, you know, you think you're progressive, and then you realize there are things that aren't even on your radar. And I am so reliant upon young people to, which is, you know, the best job I have is that I'm talking to young people all the time to keep me on my toes about what's coming down the pike and, you know, what their concerns are and what the world they want to build looks like.
Finally, Robin, what are you looking for?
Well, it's a great question. So I'm looking at the fight over like 5 things, maybe 6 things quickly in terms of moving beyond police repression. I'm looking at the continuation of the fight that Jelani wrote so eloquently about a couple of years ago, Reverend William Barber and Lucille Harris's struggle with the Poor People's Campaign that's ongoing. I'm looking at the fight against a healthcare system that was ill-equipped because it's driven by private equity, not only because we have a terrible president, had a terrible president. I'm looking at the way we can sort of continue to deal with violence beyond state initiated violence, but looking at the fact that 2020 was the deadliest year for trans people of color, and also deadly for anyone dealing with intimate partner violence or gendered violence, domestic violence, because the pandemic exacerbated the condition, but it was already there, that this is a fight that we have to fight. And finally, that we can remember that we live in a world. And I'm looking forward to the work of a new group called the Dissenters, or Dissenter Youth, that is basically reminding us that we have to fight militarism and US foreign policy, and that the triplets of militarism, racism, and materialism are still before us, as well as patriarchy and other forms of violence against us. But we've got to fight on this global level. And that's what I'm looking forward to, the continuation of a very old struggle into the 21st century, into 2021 rather.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you. If we were in person, this would be the point where we would have resounding applause for our guests, Diva Woodley, Robin D.G. Kelley, Farah Griffin, and Jelani Cobb. And also deep thanks to Mabel Wilson, our director at the Institute for Research in African American Studies, to Sharon Harris and to Sean Mendoza for all the work that they do for IRAAS and for AAADS, not just for this event, but for everything that those two entities do. Professor Wilson, did you want to send us off?
Yeah, again, I just echo Sam for this really amazing discussion. It was probing, highlighting history and the necessity of ground up organizing. That is so valuable. And Diva's point about the need to change the logic of how we analyze problems in order to make change, I think absolutely brilliant and important. And Farah's point to understand the relevance of a political imaginary, the importance of creativity to understand, and think about these possible futures. So thank you for sharing your wisdom, your work, and all those for joining. I just want to remind folks that on March 17th, we have a reading by our alum, Danielle Evans, and please see also our website, afamstudies.columbia.edu, for information on future events. So thank you and stay well. Take care.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.